Testing. Hey, everybody. We're going to get started with Genesis chapter 38. Welcome, everybody. Alrighty, welcome. All right, we're live. Live on TikTok and YouTube. You guys are welcome to come on over to Victory Life Podcast 7603 on YouTube. We're going to get started reading Genesis chapter 38. It's one of my interesting and favorite chapters. So let's get started. It happened at the time that Judah went down from his brothers and turned aside to a certain Adulamite, whose name was Hirah. There Judah saw the daughter of a certain Canaanite, whose name was Shua. He took her and went into her, and she conceived and bore a son, and he called his name She conceived again and bore a son. She called his name Onan. Yet again she bore a son, and she called his name Shelah. Judah was in Shezeb when she bore him. And Judah took a wife for his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. But Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord put him to death. Then Judah said to Onan, "Go into your brother's wife and perform the duty of brother-in-law to her, and raise up an offspring for your brother." But Onan knew that the offspring would not be his. So whenever he went into his brother's wife, he would waste the semen on the ground, so as not to give offspring to his brother. And what he did was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and he put him to death also. Then Judah said to Tamar, his daughter-in-law, "Remain a widow in your father's house till Shelah, my son, grows up." For he feared that he would die like his brothers. So Tamar went and remained in her father's house. In the course of time, the wife of Judah, Shua's daughter, died. When Judah was comforted, he went up to Timnah to his sheep shearers. He said to his friend Hirah the Adulamite, "And when Tamar was told, 'Your father-in-law is going up to Timnah to shear his sheep,' she took off her widow's garments, covering herself with a veil, wrapping herself up, and sat at the entrance to Enam, which is on the road to Timnah. For she saw that Shelah was grown up, and she had not been given to him in marriage. When Judah saw her, he thought she was a prostitute, for she had covered her face. He turned to her at the roadside and said, 'Come, let me come in to you.' For he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law. She said, 'What will you give me?' 'What will you give me that you come into me?' He answered. 'I will send you a young goat from the flock.' And she said, if you give me a pledge until you send it." He said, "What pledge shall I give you?" She replied, "Your signet and your cord, your staff that is in your hand." So he gave them to her and went into her, and she conceived by him. Then she arose and went away. And taking off her veil, she put on the garments of her widowhood. When Judah sent the young goat by his friend the Adullamite to take back the pledge from the woman's hand, he did not find her. And he asked the men of the place, "Where is the cult prostitute who was at Enam at the roadside?" And they said, "No cult prostitute has been here." So he returned to Judah and said, "I have not found her." Also, the men of the place said, "No cult prostitute has been here." And Judah replied, "Let her keep the things as her own, or we shall be laughed at. You see, I sent this young goat, and you did not find her." About 3 months later, Judah was told, "Tamar, your daughter in law, has been immoral. Moreover, she is pregnant by immorality." And Judah said, "Bring her out and let her be burned." As she was being brought out, she sent word to her father in law, "By the man to whom these belong, I am pregnant." And she said, "Please identify whose these are, the signet and the cord and the staff." Then Judah identified them and said, "She is more righteous than I, since I did not give her to my son Shelah, and he did not know her again." When the time of her labor came, there were twins in her womb. And when she was in labor, one put out a hand, and the midwife took and tied a scarlet thread on his hand, saying, "This one came out first." But as he drew back his hand, behold, his brother came out. And she said, "What a breach you have made for yourself." Therefore, his name was called Perez. Afterward, his brother came out, and the scarlet thread on his hand, and his name was called Zerah. What an interesting story. Welcome back, everybody. We're on Genesis chapter 38. We just finished reading the Holy Bible, Genesis chapter 38. I'm going to move on over to a quick reading from my handy dandy supplemental text called Creation and Blessings from Ellen P. Ross, which is very good stuff. I'm going to read a supplemental from this because it's very, very clear what's going on, but I think it's good stuff what's going on here. This is a very interesting chapter. Gosh, I have so many things to say about this chapter. Whew. I mean, I would say it's just a mess, but it is just a mess. It's a mess. Welcome back, everybody. So I'm going to read a little bit of the supplemental text on that chapter. The bizarre episode seems to intrude upon the story of Joseph, slowing the pace of that story considerably. It is a self-contained family narrative that deals with a case of family law. At issue is a distressing case of childlessness, which is common in patriarchal narratives. But in this case, the young woman is a childless widow. Story has been inserted here because it forms part of the account of Jacob's family. Note, these are the Toldot of Jacob in 37:2. In chapter 37, Joseph was a mere youth. But when Joseph brought his family down to Egypt, chapter 46, the sons of Tamar were included. There is no other place that in this narrative would fit quite so well. Moreover, the chapter has its general similarity to the Joseph story, shares a common motive in that both Jacob and Judah are deceived and subsequently forced to give recognition to a piece of evidence, and shares certain vocabulary phrases with the Joseph story. The tradition about Tamar and Judah may have served another purpose apart from its purpose within the Joseph story. For it does explain developments within the tribal organization of Judah. This tradition accounted for the origin of the three principal clans of Judah by the story of the struggle of Tamar to be the mother in Judah and the struggle of Perez to gain the precedence over his brother. Set in the formative days of the tribe, the narrative would seek to explain Judah's isolation from the other tribes and her amalgamation with Canaanites, the extinction of the oldest branch of the tribe, and the rivalry of the youngest branches. The tradition thus records the beginnings of Judah's tribal history. Suggestions that the whole episode was of Canaanite origin do not hold up under close examination, for the genealogical information makes it clear that this incident was in the family of Judah. There are only two Canaanites in the story. One marries into the family of Judah, and the other is subordinated to Judah. This episode was included here for its significance to the Joseph story. Jay Golden correlates the narrative with the present structure of Genesis by concentrating on the breaking through of the younger. Joseph, the favored heir apparent, and the younger son had apparently been removed once and for all by being sold into Egypt. But when Judah, the new leader of the brothers, refused to give his youngest son to the widow Tamar, she took matters into her own hands. As a result, twins were born to Judah with circumstances reminiscent of Jacob and Esau. 25:24. The second infant forced his way to the fore, signifying that the younger would rise to prominence. The repetition of this motive here stresses that God's design for Joseph's prominence could not be set aside as easily as Judah thought. In his own family, and in spite of his own indifference to Tamar, Judah saw the strange outworking of the plan whereby the younger gained priority in the family. In the next chapter of Genesis, then presents Joseph alive and prospering in Egypt. Tamar qualifies in the story, for she risked everything to fight for her right to be the mother in the family of Judah and to protect the family. Westerman observes that in the patriarchal narratives, revolts against the established order are characteristically initiated by women. In each case, the justice of such self defense is recognized. But the samples of Westerman list Hagar, Rebecca, Leah, Rachel, Lot's daughters, and Tamar may not all merit the ascription of justice to their self defense. But they indeed revolted against established order, especially Tamar, and the problem that they faced was in large part caused by corruption or indifference of men. This chapter has been dubbed a secular story because it does not have a great emphasis on God's acting or speaking in the events. The closest that we come to a theological point is Judah's statement that Tamar had been more righteous than he, verse 26. She had fought for her right and thereby preserved the community. He may gather from the use of this story in the present context that the underlying idea is that God was providentially protecting the community from the corruption in the family, thereby ensuring the continuation of the line. The parallel of the twins' birth with the birth of Jacob and Esau also supplies a connection with the theological points of the patriarchal stories. The event in Genesis 38 also forms a rebuke for the wickedness of Judah and his brothers in attempting to subvert God's plans to exalt the younger. The rebuke is subtle, but nevertheless is a Talonic justice. Condemnation for wickedness also is present in the story, for it reports that one son was evil and God killed him. The second son used the ancient levirate custom for self-gratification, and God killed him too. The brief reports, although not the main point of the story, do warn of the consequences of evil. The center of the episode is found in verses 12 through 26. It's framed by two sections with genealogical considerations, verses 1 through 11 and 27 through 30. The entire chapter weaves together narrative reports and speeches between the participants. The beginning section about the family introduces complication. Tamar became a childless widow. The final section reports how Tamar gave birth to Judah's sons, with the judicial approval of the family. In between these sections, the narrator traces how the problem of childlessness was resolved. This resolution is constructed around the deception of Judah by Tamar. The narrative reports Judah change of location, verse 12 through 14, allowing for Tamar's plan. The plan is worked out through a dialogue involving the business negotiation between Tamar and Judah, 15 through 19, and includes with a frustrated attempt of Judah to redeem his pledge, 21 through 23. The denouement of the story occurs in a legal setting where Tamar, about to be condemned because she was pregnant, produces Judah's pledge and was acquitted. Verse 24 through 26. When Judah failed to ensure the levirate rights of his daughter-in-law, Tamar, she deceived him. She deceived him into having sexual intercourse with her by playing a prostitute and thereby championed her right to be the mother of Judah's children, the younger of which displaced the older in an unusual birth. The outline is as follows. The faithfulness of Judah and his sons to God in his earthly program led to the near destruction of Judah's family. Judah left his brothers and married a Canaanite woman who bore him 3 sons, Onan, and Shelah. Judah gave to and then to Onan a wife named Tamar, but both sons died without progeny because of evil done before God. The Lord took the life of Tamar's first husband, because he was evil. The Lord took the life of Onan, Tamar's second husband, under Levirate law, because he was immoral. Judah reneged on his responsibility under Levirate law to give his third son to Tamar. He deceitfully withheld Shelah and placed the family lineage in jeopardy. When Tamar realized that Judah had no intention of giving Shelah to her as a husband, she deceived him by acting like a prostitute and thereby conceived his child. Judah's wife died, and after the time of mourning ended, he and Hirah went up to the sheep's hearing festival. Tamar disguised herself as a prostitute and deceived Judah so that she could conceive his child. Realizing that Judah did not intend to give Shelah to her, Tamar disguised herself as a prostitute to entice Judah. Judah promised the prostitute a kid from the goats and gave her, as pledged, his seal and his staff. Tamar became pregnant. Judah's attempt to fulfill the bargain with the prostitute failed when no prostitute could be found, so he decided to let her keep his pledge. Judah sent Hirah to regain his pledge and fulfill the bargain he made with the prostitute, but no prostitute could be found. Judah abandoned the effort, deciding to let her keep the pledge. When Judah discovered that Tamar was pregnant, he ordered her to be burned to death. But when she proved that he was the father, he admitted that she was in the right. 3 months later, Judah learned that Tamar was pregnant. When Judah ordered her to be burned to death, she produced his pledge. Judah admitted the wrong done to Tamar in not ensuring her rights and recognized that she had done right. Judah allowed her to live, but he did not take her as a wife. Tamar gave birth to twins, and although Zerah's hand appeared first, Perez was actually born first. Tamar gave birth to twins. The midwife marked the first hand to appear with a scarlet thread. Perez forged through to be firstborn. Zerah was born. So in the development of this, Ross goes on to say, God's people often complicate his program by their failure or refusal to fulfill their responsibilities. The first 11 verses of this chapter present the complication that Tamar faced. Typical of such narratives, the writer had to provide the setting with genealogical information. The beginning of the book of Ruth, with its report of the family members, their move to Moab, the marriages of the sons, the death of the men, and their surviving widows. Here, Judah separated himself from his brethren and married a Canaanite woman. This act was out of harmony with the will of the patriarchs not to marry Canaanite women. Jacob says he was also the first of his brothers to lower himself by seeking intercourse with Canaanites. From this marriage, Judah had 3 sons. The plot develops with the account of the marriages of Judah's sons to Tamar. She was given to Ur, but Ur was displeasing to the Lord in some way, and the Lord slew him. No details are provided here, but the fact that he was wicked was sufficient to warrant it untimely death. Whenever this motive appears in Genesis, it describes something deserving of divine judgment. Notably, in Genesis 6, the whole population was evil, and God destroyed them. In Genesis 19, the wicked people of Sodom were overthrown by the Lord. So whatever Ur was in the custom of doing, he was in that company, and the narrative interprets his death as divine justice. By an application of levirate marriage, Tamar was given to the second son, Onan. This custom, presented here in a slightly different form than its definition under the law, Deuteronomy 25, had as its purpose the raising up of the name of the deceased over his inheritance. There was no purpose for the second marriage other than to ensure that the line of the deceased, would continue through his window. But Onan had no such plan. He was willing to use the custom to have Tamar, but since he was unwilling to raise up a child through it, he would regularly spill Sahet, his seed, on the ground. Here, then, he was another wicked member of the family, one who would use the law to gratify the flesh, and rather than take the responsibility bound up in the custom, would destroy the seed. This attitude of gratification without responsibility has been repeated from generation to generation in immoral people. The Lord slew Onan as well because it displeased him. Judah then withheld his youngest son from marrying Tamar, fearing that he might lose this son as well. Tamar, who, according to the law, had the right to be a mother of the heir, was thus not given that privilege. She would remain a widow, and a barren widow at that. She would have to take matters into her own hands if she was to be granted the rights under the law, if the family line was to continue. These first verses, then, present a picture of a corrupt family. Judah continued his irresponsible course. He had earlier moved the sale of Joseph, then separated from his brothers and married a Canaanite, and now had seen the fruit of that marriage thoroughly evil, and so refused to give the younger son to Tamar. The only bright spot in the family would be Tamar, and he would be too slow to recognize it. It is clear that the complications were caused by the failure and the refusal of the men in the family to live obediently to God's laws and to fulfill their responsibilities faithfully. Ross goes on to say God's people often resort to desperate, deceptive actions to ensure the success of what they know to be right. The next scene continues to paint Judah as profane, but it also portrays Tamar as taking a great risk to obtain what was her right. When the time was right, that is, after the death of Judah's wife, when there would be no more chance of Judah having an heir through her, and at the time of her sheep shearing festival, when people would be in a festive mood, Tamar lured Judah into what was for him an immoral union with a prostitute. There is an interesting interchange in vocabulary in the chapter. According to the verse 15, Judah thought that she was a prostitute because she had covered her face. But when he later sent Hirah to retrieve his pledge, Hirah looked for a cult prostitute and could report back that only there was no cult prostitute there. Then, when Tamar's pregnancy was discovered, it was told to Judah that she had prostituted herself and had gotten pregnant by her prostitution. The cult prostitute was a higher class woman than the prostitute or whore. The ploy of Tamar demanded that she cover her face. By doing so, she may have satisfied scruples of Judah, who would turn aside to the prostitute, but perhaps not to the cult prostitute, for the latter might have involved Canaanite worship. Tamar's deception worked well, for Hirar went looking for the cult prostitute who would have been present at the festival time, but found none. In an interesting it is interesting to compare Tamar with Leah, who participated in deception of Jacob on his marriage night. That deception was part of the talionic justice on Jacob the deceiver. Also, through this deception was the measure for measure justice beginning to unfold for Judah, the deceiver of Jacob. But it is also interesting to compare Tamar with Ruth. Ruth, however, only claimed Boaz as her Levirate husband at the festival time and did not actually engage in sex with him. Had she done so, there could have been no reason to offer her in marriage to the near kinsman first. The negotiation of Judah with Tamar took an interesting turn. The bargain was reached for a kid from the flock, a common motive in the deceptions of this family. Until Judah could send the payment, though, he had to give his pledge, his tokens of identification. The result of the transaction was that Tamar conceived. She did what justice in the death of her husband demanded of her, but by a very dangerous scheme. The text of the scripture does not cast any moral judgment on Tamar. Delish may have had too generous in calling her a saint, but she is presented in the Bible in a most favorable light. Ruth 4:12. It is not appropriate to judge her by her Christian ethics, for in her culture at that time, her actions, though very dangerous for her, were within the law. She had the right to have a child by the nearest kin to her deceased husband. She played on the vice of Judah to bear this child, and her deception worked. Ross goes on to say, such desperate actions, even though drawing righteous indignation, reveal the faithlessness of those who fail in their responsibilities. The third scene adds hypocrisy to Judah's lack of integrity. When Tamar was reported pregnant, Judah condemned her to be burned to death until it was proven by the seal and the staff that he was the guilty party. Then, rather than include himself in any punishment, he simply exonerated her. Tamar was exonerated by these words of Judah: she has been more righteous than I. This is a critical appraisal and calls for close study. Judah is at least saying that Tamar was more in the right than he, for he did not fulfill his responsibilities. Tamar did nothing that the law did not entitle her to do. Although her method was desperate, she won the right to be the mother of Judah's children and, in the final analysis, was held up as the more righteous. Brueggemann says, the narrative contains a radical critique of morality for those who will pursue it. The text makes a judgment about relative guilt. Tamar has committed the kind of sin that the good people prefer to condemn, engaging in deception and illicit sex and bringing damages to a good family. For a moment, until aware of his own involvement, Judah reacts on the basis of that sort of morality. In that context, a new insight about righteousness comes out of the mouths of Judah. He draws an unexpected conclusion in the midst of this sordid story of sexuality. there is a new understanding of righteousness. The story may give us pause about the unusual bourgeois dimensions of sin. What is taken most seriously is not a violation of sexual convention, but damage to the community, which includes a poor, diminished female. This scene then is a turning point. Tamar's risky ploy came to light, but she was exonerated as being in the right. In the process, however, Judah's reputation suffered another blow. He was immoral and hypocritical. It is often the case that a desperate act to set things right will reveal the reason for the act. Someone else has been irresponsible or faithless. Ross goes on to say, God may use such desperate actions to bring about his will when faithlessness appears to hinder it. The final scene reveals the outcome. As a climax to this tangled story, these verses provide the significance of the chapter. God granted twins to Tamar. The line of Judah continued because of her. The births, however, were unusual. The narrative reports how the second child broke out first, prompting the midwife to exclaim, "What a breach you have made for yourself." The verbal paras, to break through, frequently occurs with the cognate accusative pares, a breach. Elsewhere, the expression refers to judgment breaking forth, but here it simply describes a breaking out. This event, in turn, provided the meaningful name Perez, he who breaks through. The naming signified the completion of Tamar's struggle and also depicted the destiny of the tribe of Perez, who later became dominant. The second child was named Zerah because a scarlet thread was tied around the hand before Perez forced through to be born first. Zerah became the founder of the Zerahites and an ancestor of Achan. The name Zerah, Zerah in pause, is not explained by a wordplay, but the emphasis on the scarlet thread implies the meaning. In Western Aramaic, is a scarlet thread. Zahori is a scarlet thread, as is Babylonian Zahuritu. If such a word was behind the meaning of Zerah, connecting the name to the idea of the scarlet thread, Sani, it would involve a metathesis. In biblical Hebrew, however, Zerah refers not to a scarlet, but to a rising dawn. Perhaps the name meant something like God has shone forth. There seems to be no connection with an idea of shining in Genesis 38, unless the attempt to come out first was commemorated with a name used often for the dawn. It may be that the name referred simply to the shining string. These births, with their commemorative namings, remind us of the births of Jacob and Esau. In both cases, the younger struggled to be first. In the birth of Perez, it was as if the oracle given to Rebekah had been revived in the line of Judah. In Judah's family, in spite of his own attempts to halt Tamar's opportunity to conceive, twins were born, and the younger surpassed the elder. The significant aspect of this incident is the connection to Joseph. Judah and his brothers had sold their younger brother into slavery, thinking that they could thwart God's plan that the elder brothers should be subservient to the younger. God worked out the principle through the births of Judah's own family, affirming that Joseph's leadership over his brothers could not be so easily aside as Judah would discover. In an exposition of this story, the main point within the argument of the book will have to deal with the way that God was working on Judah through the Talonic justice. The central idea will be worded as follows: those who disregard God's plan and pursue a life of self-gratification, God will correct, often using Talonic justice in the correction. There are many ways to state this point, but the wording does convey what the point of the story is within the story of Joseph. The way that the whole event works out is ironic. The thing that Judah tried to prevent happened, and it was with his means of correction. And it was his means of correction. If it had been left up to Judah, the family would have assimilated with Canaanites, but Tamar retrieved the line and served as the corrective. Of course, if the expositor wishes to focus on Tamar, then the entire idea would have to be recast along these lines. In the midst of corruption and faithlessness, the faithful may have to take risk to do what is right. Woo! What a story. Y'all, that was heavy. That is absolutely just heavy. I don't even know where to start. Y'all, the story of Tamar. And y'all thought it was just Tamar Braxton who had a lot going on. Woo! That is a story. That is Genesis chapter 38. For folks on YouTube, here's what I want to do. I'm going to on YouTube. I'm going to end this live and then I'm going to restart it because I want the reading separate from the conversation. So I'm going to hang up my YouTube really quick and then I'm going to open it right back up. So just come right back. I'm going to open it right back up. I want to separate these things and I don't feel like doing video edits. So I'm going to just hang up and open it right back up. So hop right back in a second.